I'm Katie Glenn Bass. I am the research director at the Knight First Amendment Institute, which is based here at Columbia. Thank you so much for being here today. Also, because we do have a really good crowd, when you're sitting down, if you could try to move into the seats in the center of the row so that people can slide in on the outside after they get their food, that would be great. I want to thank our co-sponsors for their support for this event, the Lee Center and the Newmark Center at the Journalism School. At the Knight Institute, we work to defend the freedoms of speech and the press in the digital age. Our work on press freedom has taken many forms over the years. Through our litigation program, we have fought for the right of journalists and the public to attend bail hearings in Texas. We've brought suit against the makers of spyware used against journalists in El Salvador. And we filed an amicus brief in the Associated Press's case challenging their exclusion from the White House press pool. In our research program, we have documented the mistreatment of journalists by law enforcement officials covering public protests, and we've worked to identify paths to stronger protections for the press in that context. We did that work with Joel Simon, who is one of today's speakers and a former visiting fellow at the Institute. As part of that project, Joel wrote a powerful report that unfortunately remains very relevant today as we watch Border Patrol officials mistreat journalists covering protests against ICE, and we produced an award-winning documentary called Flashpoint. Today's event also grows out of a major research initiative that the Institute began in 2023. We worked in partnership with Professors RonNell Andersen-Jones and Sonja West, who are both speaking here today and who are former visiting scholars at the Institute. That project, also called The Future of Press Freedom, brought together leading scholars of law, communications, and history, as well as journalists and press freedom advocates, to write essays addressing the most crucial questions about the role of the press in our society today, including the reasons the press is specifically protected by the First Amendment, the role of press protections in preserving American democracy at this moment of peril, and how the Supreme Court is likely to look at protections for news gathering and news gatherers in the future. Those essays were published this summer in an edited volume by Cambridge University Press. The entire book is free to access online, and if you haven't already grabbed one, there are postcards available near the drinks table that have a QR code on them that will take you right to the book. Today's conversation will draw on many of the themes that are expounded upon in that book. We're so grateful to Professors Andersen-Jones and West for all their work to bring this project to life, and we hope you'll take a look at it after the event. Just one housekeeping note now, there will be Q&A for the panelists after they've had some time to discuss amongst themselves. That Q&A can be done either by going up to one of the standing mics in the room, or we will also be showing a QR code behind them that you can scan to enter a question online, and it will go up to the moderator to ask them. Just a reminder for those of you coming to the standing mics, a question is a short sentence that ends in a question mark. And with that, I want to thank all of today's speakers for joining us here, and I want to welcome Margaret Sullivan, who in addition to being an accomplished journalist, runs Columbia's Newmark Center for Journalism Ethics and Security, to give her remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie, and it's great to be here, given the subject matter, which is very close to my heart and close to the work I do. In addition to being here at Columbia, I write for The Guardian US about the media, politics, and culture, and I write a Substack, which is called American Crisis. So I'm kind of clued into this whole subject, and I care about it deeply. So I just want to talk for a few minutes before the panel begins and kind of give people here a zoomed out view from 30,000 feet about what's been going on in the realm of press freedom over the past, especially over the past sort of 9 months to a year. So, and I must say that it's a little distressing. Did I do that? Did I fix it? Amazing. It is a little distressing, but somehow things look a little brighter today for some reason. I'm an opinion columnist. I have opinions. Okay, so about a year ago, there was a lot of conversation before the election about this thing that Jay Rosen at NYU had urged, that the media, that the press would focus on, and this was his phrase, not the odds, but the stakes. Not the odds, but the stakes. Not the horse race, not the polls, not the savvy interpretation of the latest campaign drama, but the stakes for the election. What would happen if each of these major candidates were to be elected? And I wrote about this, and in fact, I wrote a Guardian piece about what the stakes would be for press freedom. I knew that they would be high, and that, in my view, the election of Donald Trump to a second term would be dangerous in the realm of press freedom. I tried to urge people to be focused on the stakes of that. Now, from the perspective of months later, I guess I would have to say I just didn't know how high the stakes would be or what kind of danger we'd actually be in. So let me just tick down some of what has happened. The media has continued to consolidate. There are fewer and fewer owners of big news organizations. There are chains, there are corporations. Disney owns ABC, Paramount Skydance owns CBS, and on and on. So media consolidation continues apace, and if anything, it's happening at a faster rate. The control of news organizations by billionaires such as Jeff Bezos, such as Patrick Soon-Shiong at the LA Times, is a big factor that we're seeing play out. And we're seeing, well, I think the continued decline of a certain kind of reality, because local news, which is more trusted, which gives people in communities a common basis of understanding, local news has continued to decline. And I feel strongly about this because I was the editor of a local newspaper in my hometown, the Buffalo News. While I was there, the newsroom was 200 people. It's now down to, on a good day, about 50. And that's happened all over the country. And that happens in places where it's also occurred that many local newspapers have just simply shuttered and gone out of business. And we're also seeing news organizations, not everyone, but many, can capitulate to Trump and to the Trump administration by, for example, settling lawsuits that did not need, in my view, and in the view of many First Amendment experts, did not need to be settled. They could have been fought, they should have been fought, but they were settled. And each time that happens, it gets easier to do the next one. It gets easier for the administration to say, no, we don't like that story, we don't like that editing, we're going to sue, and as you can see, we're always successful, so you might as well capitulate now. You've also seen opinion sections and news organizations as a whole make a pretty strong move to the right. And two cases in point, storied news organizations, the Washington Post, where the opinion section has now declared that its views are about free markets. That's kind of what they're trying to do. I think I date the real trouble in this whole realm back to the endorsement editorial of Kamala Harris that was pretty much ready to go. It was in draft form, and Jeff Bezos caused it to be pulled and not published, and that was sort of one of the first of these recent events that's continued to happen. By the way, the Post has lost something like 250,000 subscribers over that. So the subscribers aren't happy. Was it a great business move? Probably not. Not from the point of view of subscribers. Maybe from the point of view of protecting one's other business interests. And then, of course, CBS, which now has a different kind of corporate ownership, an even bigger media company, a new editor-in-chief in Barry Weiss, and, I would say a much more pro-Trump friendly feeling about it than it did just a few months ago. And same with the LA Times, maybe not to the same extent, but certainly this is happening. So, what's happening, big picture here in the realm of press freedom in the United States, we know that when a government is moving toward autocracy, one of the first things they want to do is to control the message. How do you control the message? You control the press. And there's just been a lot that's happening in that direction, and it's very worrisome. It's really tough for me. I worked at the Washington Post for 6 years. It's really hard for me to see what's happening in their opinion section. And I should say, I continue to admire what's happening on the news side there. So it's not all one way. So, I want to make sure in my big picture look here that I mention some bright spots, which there are a number of. Katie mentioned that the Knight Institute has joined and supported the AP in its decision not to simply say, sort of let Trump rewrite their style book. Trump said, as you may know, some of you may know, or some maybe not, that from now on, we're going to call what was the Gulf of Mexico, we're going to call it the Gulf of America. The AP says, well, actually, we have a global readership, and we're not going to do that. This resulted in punitive measures from the administration toward the AP, and there's been legal action. The AP won a round and I guess lost a round, and I'm not sure exactly where it stands now. But the beauty of it is that they have stood up and not merely capitulated, and not, I don't think it's intended to be, argumentative or personal or anything like that. It's just they're doing their job and protesting when they can't do their job the way they did before. I thought it was encouraging that pretty much the entire Pentagon press corps got together and said, no, we are not going to agree to something that basically involves letting the government decide what we can and can't write about. No, we're not going to agree to that. If that means we lose our credentials, so be it. And, it was pretty much across the board, including, I should add, Fox News and Newsmax, two very conservative outlets, along with all the major networks and all the major newspapers and so on, and the wire services. Everybody pretty much said, nope, we're not going to do that. And I thought that kind of solidarity was important and good. We've also seen some news organizations, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, not settle cases brought by Trump or the administration, but rather, holding their ground and doing so firmly. And that's good to see as well. And although this isn't exactly the press, it sure was interesting to see the pushback and the very effective pushback against Jimmy Kimmel being taken off the air after his remarks about the reaction to Charlie Kirk's assassination. And that it was particularly good to see that criticism included a bipartisan element. It wasn't all Democrats, it wasn't all liberals, it included some prominent Republicans. And in fact, he was brought back on the air, and eventually even the owner, the Sinclairs of the world, the owners of local TV stations eventually said, yep, we're going to put him back on the air too. So I thought that was good to see. And I would also just mention, because I talked about local news, it's very heartening to see the rise of nonprofit and other startup news organizations that are helping to fill the gap, including, for example, in New York City, the news organization called The City, and so many others around the country, from Cal Matters in California to the Texas Tribune and many, many more. So that's a positive thing that I think will help us preserve our democracy. So it is a mixed bag, but certainly one that includes a lot of worrisome stuff. Again, it's very important, I think, that people, that the citizenry understand what the stakes are now, as well as would have been nice if they truly understood beforehand. But it's important now as well. And so to put this kind of attention on the future of press freedom in this edited volume, in this panel, and in the work that these different organizations based at Columbia are doing is extremely important, and it's so fantastic to see such a huge crowd here. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks for your attention. We're going to have a great panel. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much to Katie and to Margaret for those wonderful opening remarks. My name is Sonja West, and I, along with RonNell Andersen Jones, down at the other end of our panel, are one of the co-editors of the book we are talking about today that we worked on with the Knight First Amendment Institute when we were senior visiting research fellows. And it is my honor today to moderate our terrific panel. I'm going to give extremely brief introductions to our panelists, and then I have a number of questions for all of them, but I also very much welcome a conversational approach for you're all welcome to pipe in whether or not I have specifically called on you, Socratic style. And then we're going to reserve some time at the end of our discussion for audience Q&A, which, as Katie mentioned, we can take questions both through the QR code, which will pop up on my little iPad here, or through the microphone if you would wish to ask a question that way. Okay, perfect. So first, quick introductions of our panelists. I'll start down at the other end with RonNell Andersen Jones. She is the University Distinguished Professor and the Lee E. Teitelbaum Chair in Law at the University of Utah. And then I next have Nora Benavides, who is Senior Counsel and Director of Digital Justice and Civil Rights at Free Press. Next we have Azmat Khan, who is the Birch Assistant Professor at the Columbia Journalism School, where she also leads the Simon and June Lee Center for Global Journalism. And next to me I have Joel Simon, who is the Director of the Journalism Protection Initiative at CUNY's Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism, and also a former Senior Research Visiting Fellow at the Knight Institute. Okay, I wanted to start just for a second of taking a check on sort of the moment of time we're in. And RonNell, my question is really for you to get us started. Government hostility toward the press is nothing new. From the very beginning of our country, we had the government throwing newspaper editors in jail under the Sedition Act. We had, up through the Nixon administration, very famously having an enemies list that included many journalists. The Obama administrations had an unprecedented use of the Espionage Act and other legal tactics to try to get at journalists' confidential sources. Yet, I believe we are all here today with the message that even in spite of that history, we think something unique and something dangerous is going on at this moment. So could you just get us started by letting us know sort of what is so perilous at this moment when it comes to the press and press freedom?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks to everyone for being here, and especially tonight for hosting us and for supporting this book, which I think I feel like the book was prophetic in ways that I wish it had not been. We gathered these folks together, starting in 2023, to think about the moment and to acknowledge the fact that freedom of speech and freedom of press in particular are sort of constantly chasing the last battle, constantly responding to the last wave of problems. And so free speech doctrine is very much sort of lives and breathes by post-McCarthy doctrine. And free press doctrine very much emerges from post-Watergate thinking and the kinds of problems that sort of ways that we had to grout the doctrine to recognize risks that we didn't think existed. And I think we're in that moment again, where we are seeing workarounds from tools that served us well when old norms were in place, but a lot of those norms have disintegrated. And I think the one thing that really came of the gathering of so many different voices for this volume was this recognition of a confluence of threats. And I think that's the sort of key piece that makes the moment different than others that we've experienced in the past. Certainly political threats of the sort that Margaret outlined, but those political threats are coupled with and emboldened by a set of other threats, economic threats and social threats and technological threats that converge in a way that I think creates more crisis points and robs us of some of the go-to solutions that we've seen in the past. I'll give just like one example that I think shows how this confluence is happening. As recently as a couple of years ago, whenever I got invited to big media law events, it was to talk about New York Times versus Sullivan. And the case law that people wanted to talk about, the sort of threats from the Supreme Court about the potential of unwinding this protective doctrine that exists in the defamation space. And now we see the sort of new layer of threat doesn't live in the law itself, but lives in the practicality that surrounds the law. So as recently as the cases that Margaret was describing, we see news organizations that are sued for defamation under frivolous claims, or even if not frivolous, winnable, challengeable claims, who are nevertheless settling and making large donations to, for example, presidential libraries on these sorts of claims. And it's because of the confluence of threats, the confluence of issues, all of which are addressed in the book. The economic threats mean that a threatened lawsuit can be cripplingly expensive for many, even of the strongest news organizations. The political threats mean that levers of regulatory power can be wielded against news organizations that refuse to settle in these suits. The sort of corporate capitalist threats that exist from the consolidation of media increase that desire to be favor-seeking. The sort of social threats, when we now have to think in those situations about juries who are now a decade into the vilification, the active vilification of journalism in ways that make them less amenable to press freedom arguments. And so, and the social media threats, right? That even if you move forward with this defamation suit, the likelihood that the defamatory material will continue to get amplified rather than resolved through social media patterns, they all come together in a way that make the decision-making not really rise and fall on the doctrine anymore, but instead on this coalescing stream of threats. And I think that's the thing that makes the moment different than we've seen before.
Okay, great. So let's kind of think this through from the ground up. And I'd love to get some input, particularly from those of you who've been studying sort of more what's really going out there on the ground of what does it look like? What is it like to try to practice journalism today? What sort of threats are people facing in sort of the day-to-day of journalism? And Joel, I'd love to start with you. You did a report for Night covering democracy, looking specifically at something that still is remaining sadly in the news, the coverage of protests and interactions with law enforcement. What can you tell us about what it's like to be one of these people literally on the front lines trying to bring news to people?
Yeah, well, before I get to that, can people hear me? Yeah? Okay,
Okay.
that. There we go. There's a simple problem. It's called a switch. They solved that problem. I'm not going to be able to solve this other problem. That's a much bigger one. So I just want to preface my get to your specific point about the reality that journalists confront covering protests, but I want to just sort of pick up on what RonNell said and really what the work that both of you have done, the scholarship that you've done around both in compiling this book and also around the way in which a kind of deference in that legal institutions, your research focuses on the Supreme Court, have paid to the role of the press and the institutional role, have shaped jurisprudence. And I think that's a function, and everything that we're talking about today is really a function of a change in the power dynamic. The power dynamic between journalists and the press. I mean, I think Nixon's impulses were probably not that different from Trump's. He just had, the media as an institution had more power to resist, and it has less power today. And so that shapes the interactions between law enforcement and the media, because it's a different kind of media that's out there covering protests. Certainly during the civil rights era, we saw horrific abuses committed by law enforcement against journalists covering events in the civil rights movement in the South. But you know, after that period, there were sporadic outbreaks, but there was a kind of recognition of the institutional role and a kind of rapprochement between the media and law enforcement. Sometimes it really worked to the disadvantage of the marginalized community because law enforcement was given much more deference than it deserved. But you know, on the streets, there was a kind of cat and mouse give and take, and journalists were able to kind of do that kind of street reporting, cover protests, engage with law enforcement. And that really shifted, I mean, it really shifted if you look at the numbers in 2020 with the social justice protests that emerged in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder. And a lot of those protests were targeting law enforcement itself and its own behavior. And then they reacted, you know, with violence in many instances. And journalists were caught up in that. So, I mean, it was in the context of a generalized crackdown on civic rights, if you will, in the context of these protests. But there was really no effort made to kind of give some deference to journalists and their role. In fact, it was the opposite. In many instances, they were specifically targeted because of their role as journalists and because of the hostility that law enforcement felt towards them. And they didn't really, and it was true that in many of these protests, the journalists were acting much more informally. They weren't associated with large institutions. Some of them were really average citizens, just engaged in news gathering. They didn't have lawyers behind them. And we saw you know, well over 100 arrests and detainments of journalists and hundreds of physical assaults. And that's carried over. I mean, it's just, we could sort of go case by case, whether we're talking about Los Angeles, we're talking about what's happening in Chicago, we're talking about you know, there have been incidents here in New York, there have been incidents almost everywhere, where these kinds of, where ICE agents or federal law enforcement has been deployed, and all of the data, everything I've cited, I saw Kristen McCudden was here. It's, you know, it's from the Press Freedom Tracker, and they've done you know, you can see the evidence that this is taking place, and this is the kind of nature of the interaction between police and law enforcement everywhere. And this is, again, it's a function of the shifting technology, the shifting way in which journalists is carried out, and the shifting power dynamic.
Asma, I wonder if you have anything you want to add to any of these, but sort of specifically also, we're focusing today a lot on law, we're focusing on official government actions, but of course there can be non-government threats to the press as well. Can that be also part of the picture we paint about sort of what's going on the ground?
Absolutely. We are seeing threats on an unprecedented scale. I know that this conversation is largely framed around the Trump administration, but I would argue that over the last 2 years, we've seen really unprecedented threats to press freedom across the board. And before I get into sort of how that's come about and what's materializing for different demographics of journalists and the idea of press freedom, I just want to poll the audience. How many of you are familiar with the arrest and deportation of Mario Guevara? Just raise your hand if you are. This is a journalist who was live streaming and covering. He's a Salvadoran journalist who is reporting on the protests and was arrested and picked up and deported. And how many of you have heard of Sami Hamdi? Great. Okay. He was a British political commentator in the United States, here on a visa, and was scheduled to give different speeches. And I think last week was picked up under very similar circumstances with a fraction of the attention or recognition for what had happened to him. My colleague Ida Alami actually just wrote a wonderful article in the Columbia Journalism Review looking at these two arrests and what they mean and what is happening. Sami Hamdi had been quite outspoken when it came to the issue of Gaza and Palestinian rights. And we have seen things like that occurring. Certainly we've seen it, for example, with Rumeysa Ozturk. You know, she was a student at Tufts who published an op-ed that, if you read it, I really would encourage you to read it. It's quite banal in what it argues and what it talks about. But she was literally, and you can watch the video, as I'm sure many of you have seen, right? She's kidnapped off the street for an op-ed and arrested. And we have seen this happen, you know, obviously some of these are in the context of the Trump administration, but we've seen our student press kicked off of campus during an NYPD raid during the Biden administration. We can see the targeting and killing of journalists abroad explicitly in many cases, and you can see the reverberating effects that can have when it is used as one sort of, when it goes uncontested elsewhere, and then you might have the Trump administration come into power. You know, what is to stop, for example, a journalist who is on a boat, you know, near the United States from being targeted and killed? And so we see this sort of across the board. And I wanted to encourage some thinking, whether you're running a news organization, whether you're a student journalist, whether you're an editor or a reporter, but I think everyone in this moment needs to recognize the extent to which what we're seeing is unprecedented. It is not just linked to the Trump administration, but it is deeply exacerbated by that. And you need to sit down and actually, I would argue, do a strategic vision for yourself. Even if you're a student journalist, you have to figure out where you as a journalist fall within the ecosystem of journalism these days. And there are, you know, it's a very big tent, right? We have news outlets that I think are quite averse to the idea of advocacy, or maybe they perceive what is advocacy in different ways. And then there are news outlets and freelance journalists that work with different rules. But no matter where you fall within that ecosystem, you need to take it up a notch. And that can include not just advocacy, it can just be as simple as coverage, right? I think a lot about how some of these changes we're seeing and who's being targeted and how these threats to journalists, young and old, international and domestic, really, I think, are not even just being documented enough. You know, there should be new beats. Think about how in the wake of 9/11, all of a sudden, this national security correspondent beat came to exist. But it's not even just the creation of a new beat so much as it is like mainstreaming the coverage of these issues for every assigned beat that already exists. So you should be looking at, for example, are you losing access to public records, not just nationally, but locally? And if you are, you should be writing about it. Like that should be part of your beat of whatever issue you're covering, right? Like there are ways in which people need to rethink what these threats are and just even covering them. So no matter where you fall in this sphere of your ability to sort of be flexible or nimble or to call things out, I think it's really important to do. One last thing that I just want to add is that there are a lot of lessons as well to be learned from war correspondents and people who have reported in regimes where there's just incredible authoritarianism. Lessons that need to be applied in newsrooms here, takeaways for conflict reporting when it comes to safety, when it comes to protecting yourself against harassment and these campaigns to discredit people. You know, we've seen student journalists get targeted by groups like Canary Mission, We have seen young people and others at protests be manhandled, physically abused, and hurt. And I think that demarcation of those conflict reporters and those international reporters and the lessons we can glean from them really need to be drawn home.
Okay, terrific. Nora, I know you've actually been working closely on a number of the cases that she mentioned, and you also said you have a forthcoming report where you all have been studying what the methods the administration has been using. Can you tell us some more about what you've been learning?
Sure. Well, it's great to be here with all of you. And I was thinking about, the kind of caveat that it's great to be here despite the circumstances. And I have amended that as I've been thinking about this event, that it's great to be here because of the circumstances. I think that there is a tendency, humans always have, to bury our heads in the sand if something is displeasing. But for those of us that work closely on free speech issues, we know that free speech is often a discomforting practice. And it should be, and we should continue to look at what is happening. So first, I think I want to set that stage that these are the conversations we must be having. And every one of us, whatever small glimmer or sliver of today you take, you have to share with others, because that's really how we're going to build a collective and consistent, sustained movement for people to be educated and to take action. As you asked a little bit, I've worked closely on the Mario Guevara case. I've actually known Mario for almost 2 decades. And when he was arrested in June in Atlanta, right outside of Atlanta, another reporter texted me and said, Mario's been picked up. And of course, I thought that this would likely go very badly. And over the ensuing months, what I saw was tremendous willingness to engage in relatively lawless activity by the administration. And so I actually want to kind of ground my own comments in the culture that we are in and the political environment that has normalized lies. In an environment that feels lies are an acceptable way of doing business and politics, I think it's so obvious that, of course, journalists are going to be under attack. And anyone who then tries to promote even tentatively oppositional speech to the administration will also come under fire. And we're seeing that in the work that we've been doing and the documenting that we are now going through. It is awful work. I've analyzed personally over 500 examples from this year alone in which the administration targets journalists, protesters, law firms, academia, and a range of academia and actors within that, and even the corporate sector. But the press is uniquely under fire in a way that no other sector is. And I really see that happening in 2 ways. One is outright repression, which is super obvious. Like, you can see it. Joel talked about it. Everyone has sort of seen this. We see the way Lauren Tomasi was covering the protests in Los Angeles, and she was shot with a rubber bullet. That video, while perhaps not surprising, really shocks the senses, because you see law enforcement make eye contact and watch what she is doing as a journalist, doing constitutionally protected activity, and go after her in a very active way to target her and shoot her in the leg. So outright repression's obvious. We've seen the way Trump himself has removed journalists. Margaret mentioned a litany of examples. Most recently, the Pentagon has removed journalists, has adapted its rules. We've seen, I could literally go on and on about all of those examples, but those are easy to get and to feel something's wrong. I think there's the other half, though, of the way that our press is being weakened and the way independent press is weakened. And Margaret alluded, of course, to that as well, which is how our corporate media is capitulating. And in doing so, those twin forces have weakened what otherwise is a sense that journalists on the ground feel they have editorial autonomy, the ability to feel physically safe, and a sense that they can speak truth to power. All of those are the things that the First Amendment, and particularly press freedom, were created to protect against. And we are seeing it play out now. So in a world in which lies are now culturally acceptable, the administration has, according to NYU Law and Ryan Goodman, who is doing tremendous work, they found that in 35 cases, the administration actively lied. They falsified witness statements, affidavits, made up facts. One judge went so far as to say that the trust earned over many decades was lost in a matter of weeks because of the way that the administration courts that kind of lawlessness in its own documents. And so what we're up against is not just that kind of willingness to be untrue. We're up against then the coordinated set of forces that RonNell has mapped out that show us that those seeking to maintain, promote, and find facts are under fire. And when we are under fire in that way, the only thing we can do is continue to do it. We cannot wait until there is this like sense of hope, that washes over us. We have to actually continue to promote journalists. And I'll close this with just mentioning briefly, and sort of through my work with Mario, that Mario's case was not the last of an immigrant, of a streamer, of someone that is unaccredited doing work that must be done. He was the only reporter that was usually on the scene when ICE would go pick up people and conduct raids. He was providing local on-the-ground news in Spanish to communities that really didn't have anyone else to turn to in these more rural places. And he was super well known. Everyone, ICE agents, everyone would say, oh, there he is. Mario's on the scene, streaming for his audiences. But we've now also seen Yaqub Vahandre, who was in Dallas, and he was picked up for filming and streaming police. We've seen the Sami Hamdi case. He was picked up while at an airport. There are these kind of more fringe actors that I would propose are themselves conducting journalistic activity that deserve and must have the kind of protection that the purist press freedom world has always granted and felt is bestowed upon journalists who are part of the New York Times or whatever other outlet. And so as we descend, we're really descending into this kind of authoritarian takeover. Attacking the press is obvious, it's page one, but it's attacking those most vulnerable, the immigrant journalists, the unaccredited journalists, the streamers and new media people. Those are the ones that when you see, you know that what's coming is a broader chilling effect that is pervasive across society.
Yeah, I actually wanted to build back up because I definitely want to talk some more about what Margaret brought up for us about the capitulation of the major media companies. I think even as depressed as we all are, I'm not sure many of us saw it coming quite at that level. And then I think it is a really interesting dichotomy when we have these major media companies, sometimes literally owned by billionaires who are folding over very quickly. And then we have these other stories that you all were just telling us about where it's some of our most vulnerable news gatherers, immigrants, freelancers, student journalists who are fighting the good fight, but yet of course have this vulnerability that makes them less able to fight legally. So I'm going to throw this first to RonNell, but then I'd love to hear from the rest of you about sort of what your take has been about the institutional capitulation, how that interacts with our current executive's use of lawfare as not what we often thought of the law as a offense for journalists, and now it's being used against them as an arrow. What's your sort of feelings about all this?
Yeah. This is the root of the problem at the moment. It isn't the absence of supportive law. It's the absence of a willingness to invoke that law or an absence of an ability to invoke that law. And in some respects, a lot of the most recent episodes that we have seen actually are quite surprising in that historically, we do not ordinarily have governments that are as willing to announce their retaliatory motives out loud as we have seen in recent months. And a lot of the doctrine, the sort of last stage, the doctrine that emerged from the last wars that we had on these fronts, really anticipated and tried to grout some of that space about retaliatory motive. And they're hard doctrines, or traditionally, right? I teach my students, these are hard, it's hard. It's difficult to prove, for example, that jawboning occurred, the kind of influence on third parties to bring about the coercion that we want to stop, that the government wants to stop speech, or retaliation for the exercise of First Amendment rights, because you have to show that parties of ordinary stamina wouldn't be able to withstand the pressure, and that the government was actually motivated by these retaliatory designs. And in recent months, one of the most perplexing things that we've seen is the administration essentially serving up on a platter really quite clear evidence of that kind of retaliatory motive, right? Things like the FCC, right? We can do this the hard way, or we can do this the easy way, or there'll be work for the FCC to do on Kimmel, or the AP, sort of highest levels of governmental authority at the White House announcing that the exclusion of the AP from the Air Force One and the White House press conferences was as a result, was in punishment for the decisions that were made. So we sit at this very strange moment where there seems to be a sort of heightened incentive on the part of the government to flex that kind of control, to sort of openly announce that kind of retaliatory behavior for all the motivation reasons that Nora's describing. And law on the books that actually takes advantage of that blatancy, that gives us the chance to sort of have winnable cases on those fronts. And the missing link is the plaintiff. And this is where the sort of quadrant of our book that was contributed by folks who think about the role of money in our media ecosystem and the exercise of press freedom in a boots on the ground way by the folks who own these companies turned out to be sort of the most prescient of the work. I think about the presentations that Victor Picard made to our working group, where he described how truly dangerous a dynamic it is for us not to have a healthy, vibrant a public press, to rely on the cooperation of big conglomerates to exercise the press freedom on our behalf, to trust benevolent billionaires to see some of these issues across the finish line. I think that the dynamic that we see at the moment can be seen simultaneously as an indictment of the government's respect for norms of press freedom and an indictment of corporate, sort of the corporate failure. But it doesn't really matter which thing it's an indictment of, and I think both things could be happening at once. The missing link between our capacity to stand in the stead of the press freedom rights of audiences, which is sort of the way that we have conceived of a lot of the exercises of press freedom in the past. It's happened as a matter of norm, and it has happened because for this one moment in time in the mid-century media, their corporate interests aligned with broader press freedom interests, broader public interests, figuring out what to do when the system of retaliation is so broad and the system of corporate control is so broad that those dots no longer connect, strikes me as one of the most important, if not the most important, press freedom issue of our day.
Anyone like to, Joel?
Sure. I mean, Nora, did you want to go first? Okay. Look, I think that it's when you see corporate capitulation, it is utterly demoralizing. It just takes all the wind out of the sails of journalists who are struggling to report and do their work in an environment in which there could be significant consequences, to see a powerful corporation capitulate in this way, and 60 Minutes is, of all of those sort of iconic institutions, It's the one that, you know, is kind of the most recognized and historically revered. To see them capitulate in this way, I think it really just undermines morale in a way that's hard to exaggerate. But I kind of wanted to make a larger point that we're all sort of touching on, which is, you know, whose rights are we defending? Who is under this umbrella? You know, we're at Columbia Journalism School, and of course, and we've also touched on this, and I, you know, take a tremendous pride in the kind of, you know, ethical principles that govern journalism and the kind of institutional client, you know, the kind of institutional resources that we brought to journalism, including, you know, the whole legal defense and all of those efforts. But I think when you look at this environment and you look at, you know, two examples that Margaret mentioned, in which kind of journalistic institutions in this kind of institutional arena failed to show solidarity, or showed it partially. One you have, you know, the AP, and you know, their effort to resist efforts by the Trump administration to get them to adopt their language, and the failure of the White House press corps to really, you know, stand up for those principles. That was definitely self-defeating. But I would say it's more self-defeating and more troubling in a way that the media failed to stand up for Mario Guevara, and didn't really see the stakes, you know, that they had in that battle, and perceive him as one of their own, and understand that, you know, the whole structure, you know, RonNell, as you defined it, you know, was created to defend by lawyers and legal institutions to kind of create an environment in which institutional, corporate, mainstream, whatever you want to call it, media could resist these kinds of pressures, and it failed to do it. And the new environment is so much broader and more inclusive. And you know, the Knight Institute was kind of created to address this reality, but so many more resources are needed, and really it's a shift in mindset. It's a shift in mindset about how, what you describe in your book, the press function, we call it, it's called different things, is achieved, and who's involved in doing that. And definitely Mario Guevara has to be part of that discussion.
Well, anytime Mario's name comes up now, I want to talk about that, but I will also get to consolidation, so don't worry, we're gonna find a way to merge them. You know, the moment that Mario was, when we learned and we were anticipating he was going to be deported, the government lied in one of its documents that he had misrepresented something in 2012. And we corrected it numerous times on the record, but the court didn't take that. And so that's part of why I'm slightly obsessed with the way that the government is lying in records and in pleadings. But when we learned that he was going to be deported, I immediately thought, oh, well, that'll make for a great headline for people, right? Suddenly, media will pay attention. He's going to be deported. And it did. It made a lot of headlines then once he was deported. But it became a kind of data point that once you reach the systemic level of awareness, it loses potency. It's like, oh yeah, he was deported, done. And so I worry that what we are now losing in how aggressive the persistent and relentless attacks on the press are, is we're losing the ability to contextualize each of them as they happen. We're so busy, of course, because we're inundated with yesterday's attacks, we can't actually digest and look at what's happening today. And that's part of the ethos of the administration, is it hides its transgressions with new transgressions over and over and over again. And it is, I think, furthered by the corporate capitulation that we are seeing. And so I often frame it as this kind of authoritarian billionaire doom loop, you know, that there's just the endless spin that goes back and forth. And we could have guessed that based on the inauguration. We saw the way these billionaires sat front row in front of the cabinet, having paid for their seats, now paying settlements for this gilded ballroom, all of that creating an environment that might sometimes be based on fear and, not wanting to have to make concessions, but I actually think it's just greed. I think that there is corporate sentiment that places profit over people, which is the heart of what we are always looking at when we think about how democracy should function. And they should function by placing people first. But we are in this environment in which a Mario Guevara doesn't get headlines and doesn't get eyeballs, so that doesn't matter. And I say that, of course, flippant, but that is the kind of mentality flip we have to work on doing. We have to convince people of that, because the corporate entities will not save us.
I just want to jump in with a little note that, when I was first reading the coverage of Mario Guevara and what happened to him, I was really struck by the distinction between how press freedom groups wrote about him and how mainstream coverage covered him. And, if you read CPJ and the Committee to Protect Journalists write-up, you would get a very clear accounting of how he had been live streaming at the time. It was very much framed in the context of press freedom. And I remember one of the first sort of stories and mainstream coverage that I read, it wasn't there. That very essential element of what had happened to him was not there. And I was really struck in some ways, but not surprised in others. And I think about this because I look at the coverage of the killings of journalists and how that was covered abroad, especially in those cases where people were intentionally targeted and in a way that was even admitted to. The coverage of that has been lacking. And it's not just that these mainstream news organizations are doing this when it comes to press freedom issues. They're doing it, this corporate capitulation that we're talking about. It appears, again, that you see other organizations taking creative, assertive stands. And I'll give one example, a shout out to an organization I'm on the board of. It's called the Freedom of Press Foundation. And when this purchase of CBS and the settlement was approaching, before the purchase, the settlement with the Trump administration was approaching, there was a real conversation at the Freedom of Press Foundation, well, what can we do to stop this? And they got really creative. And one of the things they tried, and ultimately, clearly it didn't work, but they looked at the conversation around, why they were making the case to settle, that their shareholders would be upset if they didn't. And they said, well, what if they have shareholders who would be upset if they did settle? Don't those exist? And they bought shares. The Freedom of Press Foundation bought shares of CBS, issued these letters. It did get some coverage, but I'm not saying here's a solution. I'm saying the most creative ideas are not coming from corporate consolidation. It's not coming from these corporations that we're talking about. And I really just am obsessed with this idea that everyone needs to be more creative across the board. It's why I mentioned strategic, it's silly corporate jargon, strategic vision, but in many ways, everyone needs to step back and think about ways in which they can be more creative, more imaginative to meet this moment, because it is, in so many ways, unprecedented. So you now move your metrics. And one that comes up for me in the context of student journalists, we're talking about, I have a lot of, students who are international, and they're here and they want to cover what's happening on campus, last year I had a student who broke the story of Mahmoud Khalil's arrest, but she kept her name off the story. She had to because she was an international student. I've had so many students do that. They've had no byline on stories that they did incredible reporting for because of the threat of even just having reported the story. So if you're a news outlet and you're thinking about this in this moment, well, how can I meet that moment with something more imaginative? Is it time for certain pen names and not just for the journalists? In certain cases where you need to talk to a student and you verify that this is a student, but to get an account from somebody who's international, or cases where you might want to have anonymous sourcing, which I know can be risky, is it time to change these rules? And everybody needs to be thinking about that in profound ways.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in with a hearty second to the suggestion that it is a moment that demands creative thinking and also demands multiple sources of creative thinking. So thinking about it from, thinking creatively about it from the journalism, boots on the ground vantage point, and also those of us who are working in the legal space and need to be thinking creatively and need to be employing a wide range of tools. And one of the things that was most heartening to me about the contribution that the book is trying to make is that some of the folks who work, contributors, thought really creatively about ways that we can use tools that are appealing to the governing regime to try to advance some of these goals. So Amanda Shaner, for example, contributed an essay that suggests that we should take a page from the religion clause jurisprudence from the Roberts Court that has been suggesting that a religion, because it's specified right there in the First Amendment as a First Amendment institution that's of value, is a most favored nation. So in the COVID cases, for example, the way that the Supreme Court gave exceptions to some COVID gathering rules to religions is to say, if you have any exceptions for anybody anywhere, you have to give some exceptions to religion because religion is constitutionally important as under the First Amendment. Amanda makes the argument that the most favored nation analysis, of course, also applies to journalists, that journalists, the press freedom is specified in the First Amendment, that it matters constitutionally and democratically, and that if there are exceptions that are made for anybody anywhere, journalism should be at the top of that list. It's the sort of doctrine that could really matter in a very concrete way in, for example, figuring out who can cross police lines in particular settings, right? Figuring out who can access various facilities, figuring out who can head into an ICE facility to look around. So thinking about the ways to sort of take doctrine that's developed elsewhere and creatively put it to use on behalf of those who are performing the press function strikes me as important. Originalism and history and tradition strikes me as another avenue that a lot of people are working on. In the AP case, for example, Genevieve Lakier and a team of us who are working together with the helpful support of Knight presented an amicus brief that took a history and tradition approach to these sorts of questions of access and viewpoint discrimination, being able to speak the language that the courts are suggesting that they want to speak in these moments strikes me as another creative avenue. It seems to me like there's no one path to safety for protecting performers of the press function legally, but in exactly the same way that you're describing has to be happening in journalism, it also has to be happening in law. We have to be driving at it from a bunch of different directions, and I think we have to be doing so with a singular eye on the performance of the press function, not burrowing down into the sort of, I think, old world debates about who counts as the press, but instead, right, the real constitutional functional argument that the book tries to elevate that suggests that there is a press function and those who are performing it are entitled to the protections that are constitutionally designed for those press functions, and really elevating as a legal matter, front-ending these kinds of arguments that are designed to hone in on performers of the press function, and then ideally creating a legal dynamic in which all performers of the press function rise and fall together, which suggests that those entities that are performing it at a higher level who might not want to stand back or capitulate in circumstances in which other people's press function rights are at stake, they could be incentivized to back these entities and these people because the development of the law in that front would be helpful to them in the future.
And I would just say, you know, that's a legal argument, and we heard it as a kind of journalistic argument, but it's also a political argument. It's also like this is the moment to really think inclusively about what constitutes journalism. I'm not saying that that means that, you know, we don't have a professional identity. I mean, we've gone round and round on these debates, but I just think there's so much more significant now because This is not a moment to circle the wagons. This is absolutely not a moment where the institutional kind of press, can win the debate by claiming some sort of special status. The only way to win this debate in the courts and in the public and in the political arena and within our own profession is to be magnanimous about, our recognition about who and what, how the press function is carried out and who performs that role, and ensure that their rights are protected in the law and that they, are part of a broader community. And that to me is the only viable path forward.
Yeah, so building off of this, and also I think bringing in some of the sort of themes of concerns I'm seeing in some of the questions as well, but also after I ask this question, which I'm just going to open up to the panel, welcome people if someone wants to step to the microphone as well. But one of the issues we struggled with from the very early days of our project, when we started convening working groups of scholars and lawyers and journalists, was this question that you all are sort of talking about, which is, are we here trying to defend some concept of the press that is already obsolete? What is even this thing? Where is it going? What is it heading toward? And also coming to, we didn't want to walk away from the idea also that this idea of the press from days past was perfect. In fact, we wanted to be very upfront about the many ways that it was very much imperfect, and the voices that were left out of that form of the press, or the types of ways that could affect reporting. So I'm curious if anybody has any thoughts about that forward-thinking idea of what this means to be a press, particularly in a world where people, let's just be honest, they get a lot of their news from TikTok, right? They get their news from, we are questioning now whether you can turn on 60 Minutes and feel as good about what you're seeing as you used to. It's all being sort of thrown into a blender, and at a time when we are saying we want to have stronger protections for it, we want to stand up. So do you have thoughts about this and how it might inform, maybe in a positive way, maybe in a way that this is a moment that you all are talking about, what our legal, policy, practical next steps should look like? And I'll open to you.
I want to, I consume way too much TikTok. Let me say that up front. But that's neither here nor there. I want to tell you a story from 2016 and just why it relates to now. I was leaving, I think, Karbala in Iraq, with this Shia militia headed to a village that had been attacked by ISIS. They had launched these small chemical weapons, these mustard-filled rockets. And, I'm embedded with this militia, and one of the commanders of it says to me, did you see what Obama said about Syria? And I was like, which part? He said so many. I was like, tell me more. And he's like, well, he said he was going to give every single Syrian whose house was destroyed a new home. I was like, well, when did he say this? Tell me more. And he's like, no, I watched it. I saw it. And he pulls out this video, and it is, Obama talking, and there's Arabic subtitles underneath. And, at one point he cries and he wipes a tear on his face. And, and the Arabic subtitles are him saying, I can't believe what we've done and how many innocent people we've killed. And sometimes I get so moved by it, and I don't know what to do. And I even think about throwing myself off the Tower of Chicago. He was talking about gun violence in English, and it was, something about something else entirely. But this entire militia group was convinced that Obama was, promising everyone in Syria a house. And that's what happens when you have distribution channels. This came in on a WhatsApp group, and this is a much low-level version of disinformation, right? Imagine what we have in store for us in an era where AI videos can be edited like that, where the disclosure of that is really difficult to ascertain, where we have not yet mastered the ability. And again, it goes also, I think, back to this idea of imagination and the ability to also experiment with these forms in order to protect against them, and the ways in which that will be weaponized. I think a lot about the credibility of news in an era in which AI and disinformation and the rapid, massive scale of distribution is so unwieldy, and that our corporate news organizations really have not been assertive, nor have they been collective. I really am honing in on this, like the National Journal and Dropsite News and organizations across the political spectrum need to be thinking, A, about freelancers and marginalized journalists, but they also need to be thinking about, what do we share? You know, what collective work can we be doing? What systems can we create for authenticated, verified content? And I think that collective action is sort of at the central, but I think about that Syria thing often. You know, there's millions of examples of this, but like the way I had to convince this man that that was not real, and the amount of time it took, and at one point being like, why am I even doing this? Like, why am I trying to correct him? Just imagine that on a scale we really can't comprehend.
Anyone else? Okay, we have a little bit of time left. I'd like to get through hopefully as many questions as we can, so I appreciate you trying to keep them short, as Katie said, but yes, from the audience.
Yeah, press freedom, of course, comes with two different sides. One side is reporting on what's going on, as you've just dedicated the time to, and the other side is not reporting what is going on. In other words, to put it simply, line by omission. And a brazen example of that is not reporting on how federal courts operate, where judges simply replace parties' argument with completely bogus argument of their own concoctions and their decision. And when I sued them for fraud, they defended themselves by self-giving in Pearson against Ray absolute immunity to act from the bench, quote unquote, maliciously and corruptly. And in the age where the press rips out its hair when Trump is given immunity, I thought, oh, how wonderful, you know, let them talk about the other branch of government too. And they absolutely adamantly refuse to talk about the judiciary, even though it's just a parallel branch. So my question is, of course, I'm very, very curious why it should be so. But on the other hand, I'm also curious whether, the press should not really present itself as knights in shining armor, no pun intended, but as an industry that is every bit as cynical and every bit as self-serving as any other industry. Thank you very much.
Great, and I'm going to just sort of add on to that with, again, another theme I'm seeing in the question, and it's an important one, and one that came up a lot in our discussions also for the book, which is this problem of the falling trust that the public has in the press. So again, we're coming at a point where we're pleading with people that now is this moment, now is this time to stand up for press freedom at a time when Americans' trust in the press, whatever they think that is in their mind, is at some of historic lows. So how does that factor into our conversation? How does that factor into our next steps if people don't always trust that the press is either covering or not covering or covering in the correct way the news they think is important?
I just really mourn the loss of public editors at news organizations. I think the amount of, and Margaret Sullivan being one, in my opinion, just extraordinary. And I think a lot about how often I hear, especially on campus, people that will not read mainstream papers, and also the distrust of it, the grotesqueness, and don't even get me started on reporters who will not read the coverage in their own papers. I can't tell you how many people I know who are journalists who are really questioning certain coverage, within their own papers. So what does that tell you about distrust, across the spectrum? And the extent to which, a real public accountability and transparency from honest actors is needed in a moment in which I think we've really seen that deteriorate. And I'm sure, the others of you who've had experience with people who've probably either served in those roles, but also just what that offers us, that transparency. Like, I think a lot too about access and the work news organizations are doing, and even just trying to disclose that to the public, to be more transparent with the public, to involve them in the process in many ways. I think all of that is foundational to the conversations we're having.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I think in this question there's something, we have to acknowledge that the media can be terrible. and that is often, I think, the caveat that journalists and people who work closely with media are uncomfortable doing. I sometimes joke that when I'm with journalists and lawyers, we are the least liked groups. And yet, when you need us, then you want us. We share this quest for facts and quest for reality. And given that we're in a moment where reality has been completely distorted, where our constitutional principles have been distorted, I think the task in front of us is how we invigorate a new kind of media and engagement with media. I don't know about the invitation to be creative in those solutions. I think there is a lot that you can do that is not creative, that is the bread and butter of boycotts and using your voice in the most basic ways. Dare I say, not the stuff that is watershed or different. And there are people who then can be creative in it, but we need a kind of solidarity that must unify us in everything we do, whether it is fighting for Mario Guevara's voice because it might be us that's next, whether it is understanding that someone who we vehemently disagree with has been protesting and then under siege because of using their voices. It is that kind of repeated and ongoing and consistent solidarity that we have to practice. I think it is to recognize, in no way hypocritical, that the media can be horrific in the way that it recycles, promotes, and even expands upon lies, the way that it promotes inequity. At Free Press, we have a project called Media 2070, which is a media reparations program that looks at the very long history of the media's role in boosting inequity throughout American society. I think we can do both things, though. We can look at that kind of gross hypocrisy and failure from the media, and the way that the media, like uppercase, is also the beacon of what we always have wanted. You know, when the founding fathers were worried about what the UK was doing, it was because they saw the ways that the Crown and Crown officials were going into people's homes and dismembering people for writing about the way that people should hold our leaders accountable. That was what journalists' role was to be, and it was part of what was enshrined in our press freedom ethos and in the language, ultimately, over many centuries of our jurisprudence.
And I just want to say one point on this, which is I do worry that the concept of trust and the concept of misinformation are both being weaponized in a way that kind of undermines our ability to defend essential principles related to press freedom and free expression, and to broaden the kind of, we're going to have to come to terms with the reality of this sort of free-for-all of the information space if we're going to defend rights. So, and the thing about trust is I do feel there's some bad actors in the space who are kind of if you ask people, do you trust the media as a general principle, they say no. And if you ask them, where do you get the information that you trust from, you're going to get a very different answer. You're going to get some answer. So I kind of think, and if misinformation or disinformation, I also feel is obviously an enormous problem, but it has been used in a way to drive a wedge between the kind of the professional community of journalists, which are devoted to these ethical principles, and this mob of people out there who are like leading us off a cliff and whose rights we don't value and defend. So I'm not totally comfortable with this framing. I mean, I'm being a little bit of a contrarian, but I do think, and I don't have any like magical solution for this, but I do want to just put it out there as this is a complex issue that we do have to grapple with.
I want to just be the Goldilocks baby bear to this dynamic, which is my position in my scholarship and in my public-facing work has been that both things can be true at once. That is, there's a crisis of trust in the media because the media, and at least some of its segments and at least some of its elite-driven motivations, has proven itself to be less trustworthy. And so declining trust that is a result of behaving in less trustworthy ways is earned lack of trust. But it can also be, and is also the case, that undermining trust in fact gathering and news gathering and contributors to the public sphere and in trusted information sources is a key component of an authoritarian playbook. It is one that historically has been invoked and has been invoked in declines in liberal democracies in recent years in India and Hungary and Bolsonaro's Brazil and elsewhere, and attentiveness to that tactic and a recognition of the interrelationship between democratic backsliding and press freedom backsliding strikes me as a super important component of the kinds of conversations that we need to be having. I made this comment at a conference last week that I had just, as I was heading in, I read this article that some of you probably read about the destruction of the wing of the White House, the sort of just showing up and knocking it all down, and then the conversation begins, right, sort of after we've seen the rubble. And commentators from the sort of historic preservation space were talking about something that they have a term for it in their space. They call it stake driving, which is this notion that you just take a big action that is super destructive. And the idea is that even people who sort of wouldn't have approved of the demolition of this definitely don't approve of the sort of big, empty, awful rubble. And so they'll come on board with whatever the next plan is for the rebuilding because it's superior to the destruction that exists. And I think there's a massive analogy that exists there, which is that the tactic is to sort of destroy trust in news gathering, in fact checking, in the conversations that we try to hold in the public sphere. And we've seen the vilification wave, the destruction wave, the enemy of the people wave, the fake news wave. And I think the hope is that, like, once we've sort of destroyed things, people will be so eager for anything to fill the void that they won't have a really careful conversation about what we build in its space. And I think the point here is that we have to be thinking about on both fronts. We have to be watching for the destruction of norms, but we also have to be really carefully calculating the kinds of things that we can build in the space, because there will be a willingness to build just about anything, and that's the point of the destruction.
Okay, I'm told we have time for one more quick question. We'll take from our audience.
Thank you so much for these perspectives here. I want to talk a little bit about the faceless monster that is algorithmic suppression. April 7th this past year, Facebook ends the fact-checking. TikTok is going to be purchased by Oracle, expected to be more conservative-leaning. And when independent journalists try to post about protests or about ICE sightings, the suppression and new tactics, that creativity you're talking about, people are using terms like winter boots, don't slip on ice because there's an icing. There's 24-hour music festivals. And when you look that up, you have protests. Over New Jersey, there was a military testing of probably Golden Shield drones for many months. And if you posted New Jersey drones, they were gone. Someone used Dior bags for a while. So you can learn. President Trump said we're going to release the report. He didn't. And then you have the NSA surveillance of immigrants who are on U.S. visa who post support for the protections of Gaza. All of this, what I'm trying to get to is, I'm hoping to ask you, in our digital age, is there any historical or established strategy to protect free speech that we can use against algorithmic suppression from these corporate tech giants who are showing influence from conservative establishment politics?
Anybody want to jump in?
Thank you.
I'm happy to. I'm so happy someone asked. I was like, how do I work in AI and algorithmic bias into press freedom? But they're inextricably linked, and so I'm glad you did. We don't have models from history on how to leverage and prevent or guard against the weaponization of technology by itself. I think what we are dealing with now is a kind of exploitation and harvesting of our data at a scale most people either don't know or aren't that bothered by. You know, if my Uber location pickup can be a little more precise, that's okay. Or if my ads for cowboy boots are exactly what RonNell and I were talking about at dinner last night, that's great. It makes it easier for me. I think that kind of passive consumerism has also infected our inability to really stand up against these forces from the consumer and community side. I am very worried about what's coming next year. ICE alone is getting $75 billion in the budget, and then the broader law enforcement budget will be $170 billion. They cannot spend that down to only account for facilities, training, people. There's obviously going to be state-sanctioned propaganda and the use of technology and surveillance. They are already starting to go after and leverage by the administration and ICE and DHS biometric data of protesters, immigrants. There are really quite dystopian examples already playing out. And my solution, what we've been working on at Free Press for years, is comprehensive data privacy and digital civil rights legislation. It's already been passed in dozens of states. I think we really need a floor at the federal level. We also need a number of other structural reforms. So I don't want to be sitting here and blindly say that if we just get one bill passed, which is obviously very difficult in this environment, dare I say nearly impossible, that it'll be fixed. But I do think that the gathering of our data and then the relationship between corporate surveillance and government surveillance, where third-party data brokers are just giving data because government is buying it up. They can circumvent the Fourth Amendment. They can circumvent our privacy rights. We have a very strong bench of cases that have consistently ruled in favor of our privacy rights as core First Amendment values and rights. But this will require coordination. And so I guess, as I know we're wrapping up on time, I have been pleased by things like the Jimmy Kimmel coordination and resistance, because it showed us how much we can do when we are motivated and when there is a known enemy. And when I think, what I see here is people slowly realizing that the surveillance and the passive way they participate in that is damaging at the most fundamental level, and it has helped fuel democratic backslide. So I'm happy to talk with anyone afterwards about the work that we're doing on that legislative side.
As journalists, though, I would also just add, it's really important to cover and document and expose, you know, these happenings. I was just looking at coverage yesterday, for example, of YouTube having removed hundreds of videos by 3 human rights organizations because they were placed on a sanctions list, but it's like human rights documentation and incredibly powerful work. I don't think we mentioned this, but maybe it became apparent. I'm a war correspondent, and I work in a lot of these places where these human rights abuses are documented. I see those organizations that documented these abuses work on the ground, and they've done extraordinary, powerful work journalists rely on, work so many of us learn from, and YouTube agreed to remove hundreds of these videos, just quietly disappearing them. And if you look at the media coverage, you tell me where you've seen that reported. And there's just a baseline. I would say, like, Wired has done a particularly good job of reporting on algorithmic bias, the markup. There are places that I think have really spearheaded that. But when we're looking at, mainstreaming of a lot of this, like, every reporter should be mainstreaming some of these issues into their beats and examining the suppression that you're describing. And I think that is, essential. You might think this has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with you.
And on that note, I think it's time to say thank you to our terrific panelists. And thank you all for coming today.